They expected the call to break you. Someone believed one carefully chosen sentence would make you panic, explain yourself, or reach for their approval. But when the moment arrived, you did something they had not prepared for. You stayed emotionally contained, and that silence exposed far more than an argument ever could. Hey, welcome back. I appreciate you being here, and I'm sending you calm, grounded energy. This is a general symbolic reading, so take what reflects your experience and leave the rest. We're using the cards as mirrors for emotional patterns, not as fixed predictions. Let's look at what this first image is showing us. We have the Ace of Cups reversed. Okay, this immediately speaks to emotional access being denied, not the absence of feeling, but the decision not to pour your feelings into a situation that had not earned them. For some of you, somebody assumed your heart was an open tap. They thought they could provoke you, withdraw, then return whenever they wanted, and still receive the same softness. But the cup is reversed. The emotional supply stopped. That is the first part of the failed trap. They were not simply looking for a response. They were looking for proof that they could still control your inner state. Maybe the phone call carried a strange tone. Maybe the message felt deliberately vague. Perhaps they mentioned another person, questioned your value, or acted colder than the situation required, and you noticed it. You may not have known every detail, but your body recognized the pattern. Instead of defending yourself, you paused. Instead of pouring out the truth, you protected it. This card symbolizes emotional boundaries, forming exactly where emotional leakage used to happen. Now, here's what is interesting. I don't think the person on the other end was alone in their thinking. There may have been someone waiting to hear what you said, or someone who had encouraged them to test you. The goal was to collect a reaction and turn it into a story about you. But they received almost nothing, so now the story they planned to tell does not work. And that raises the real question. What were they hoping your reaction would prove? And who needed that proof? They never anticipated your new emotional discipline. The next card is going to reveal the judgment they made about your worth before they contacted you. We have the King of Cups reversed. Okay, this tells us the judgment they made was emotional. They believed your feelings were stronger than your boundaries. For some of you, this person assumed that because you cared deeply, you could be controlled through that care. They thought one change in tone, one cold sentence, or one suggestion that they were pulling away would be enough to make you lose your emotional balance, not because you lacked value, because they believed you would forget your value the moment the connection felt threatened. The King of Cups reversed can symbolize emotional control being used in an unhealthy way. Someone may appear calm on the surface while deliberately creating instability underneath. They speak carefully. They reveal just enough. Then they wait to see whether you become anxious, defensive, or desperate for clarity. That may explain the strange composure on the other end of the call. They were watching for a reaction. Maybe they expected you to ask whether they still cared. Maybe they believed you would start explaining your intentions before they had even clearly accused you of anything. Perhaps they thought you would tolerate a disrespectful tone because maintaining the relationship mattered more to you than protecting your peace. But they misunderstood your emotional depth. They mistook it for emotional dependence. Those are not the same thing. You may have been patient with this person before. You may have offered compassion when they were inconsistent, listened when they could not express themselves clearly, or forgiven moments that genuinely hurt you. And somewhere along the way, they began treating your emotional maturity as proof that you would always absorb the consequences of their behavior. They judged your softness as access. They judged your understanding as permission. But the version of you who answered this call was no longer willing to manage somebody else's emotions while they disrupted yours. That is why your response confused them. The trap depended on you still believing that you had to prove you were loving, loyal, reasonable, or worthy of being treated properly. It depended on you doing the emotional labor while they remained controlled and distant. Instead, you let them carry the weight of what they said. And now I have to mention something uncomfortable. The calmness in their delivery may have been rehearsed. They may have planned which subject to introduce, which insecurity to touch, and how long to remain silent after saying it. For some of you, another person may have already been told exactly how you were expected to react. They thought they knew your emotional script, but you did not read your assigned lines. The next card is going to show us how this trap was designed, and whether someone else helped them prepare the conversation. We have the Emperor. Okay. This changes the way we understand the design of the call. The strategy was control, not necessarily loud control, not obvious intimidation. This feels more like someone trying to establish the terms of the conversation before you had the chance to decide whether those terms were fair. The Emperor can symbolize structure, authority, and the need to remain in command. In this position, I feel the caller wanted to control the pace, the subject, and the emotional outcome. They may have entered the conversation already believing they had the stronger position. They had a plan. For some of you, they asked questions that were unusually specific. Maybe they brought up a person or situation without explaining why. Perhaps they paused after certain statements, almost as though they were waiting for you to fill the silence with information they had not earned. And your body noticed that pressure. You may have heard a subtle change in their voice, a moment when they stopped sounding natural and began sounding careful. There could have been a sentence that felt slightly out of place, as though it had been prepared before the call began. The Emperor also makes me think someone wanted a record of emotional authority. They wanted to be able to say that they confronted you, that you became unstable, or that you admitted something under pressure. They needed your reaction to support their position. Maybe another person had influenced the way they approached you. This does not have to mean someone was literally sitting beside them. It could be a friend, relative, partner, or outside voice that had already reinforced a certain story about you. They may have been told, "Ask them this," or "Watch what happens when you mention that." The goal was to place you inside a structure they had already built. But you did not enter it. You did not rush to correct every assumption. You did not offer a vulnerable confession just because they created an uncomfortable silence. And you did not give them a sentence they could remove from context and repeat later. So the authority they expected to feel never arrived. The Emperor stood there with rules. But you were no longer asking for permission. That may be why the conversation felt strangely incomplete. They were waiting for the part where you surrendered control of yourself, and it never happened. Whatever story they intended to carry away from that call remained unsupported. Now, the method matters. They chose a live conversation because there was no time to edit, reflect, or step away before responding. They believed immediacy would weaken your boundaries. So why did they need your reaction in real time so badly? Because we have the Two of Swords reversed. Okay, this tells us they wanted to remove your ability to think clearly before you responded. A live call creates pressure because the words disappear as quickly as they arrive. You cannot sit with them. You cannot reread a sentence and ask yourself whether the question is honest, whether the assumption is fair, or whether the conversation deserves your emotional energy. They wanted immediacy. For some of you, the caller moved quickly from one subject to another. Maybe they mentioned someone else before you understood why that person was relevant. Perhaps they questioned your loyalty, implied that you had already been replaced, or acted as though a decision had to be made right there on the phone. No time to reflect, no room to regulate. The Two of Swords reversed can symbolize mental pressure reaching the point where an old defensive pattern is expected to take over. The caller may have believed that if they gave you too many emotional signals at once, you would stop listening to what was actually being said and begin reacting to what you feared it meant. That was the opening they wanted. Maybe there was an abrupt accusation followed by silence. Maybe they made a vague statement and expected you to reveal information while trying to understand it. Or they spoke with artificial detachment, hoping you would become more emotional to compensate for how little they appeared to care. But something different happened. While they accelerated the conversation, you slowed down inside. That pause was not coldness, it was discernment. You may not have answered immediately because you were separating the facts from the pressure. You were noticing that the urgency did not belong to you. Whatever answer they claimed to need in that moment could have waited if the purpose of the call had truly been understanding. And because you did not fill every silence, they were forced to hear their own words. There was no argument to hide behind, no emotional reaction to make the conversation look mutual. No dramatic response they could use to avoid examining why they had chosen that tone in the first place. Your calm changed the sound of the call. Without your panic, their urgency may have sounded unnecessary. Without your defensiveness, their accusation may have sounded unsupported. And without your pain becoming the center of attention, the intention behind the pressure became much easier to recognize. The silence did more than protect you. It reflected them back to themselves. The next card is going to reveal what they saw in that reflection, and why your composure unsettled them more than any confrontation could have. We have the Seven of Cups. Okay. This shows us what your silence reflected back to them. Uncertainty. The Seven of Cups can symbolize multiple possibilities, imagined outcomes, and a mind trying to decide which version of reality is true. Before the call, this person may have felt certain about you. They believed they understood what you wanted, what you feared, and exactly how you would respond. Then you gave them nothing predictable. And suddenly, they had questions. Did you no longer care in the same way? Had you already recognized what they were doing? Were you speaking to someone else? Had you emotionally moved on before they noticed? Or were you simply refusing to show them what you felt? Your composure created possibilities they could not control. That was what unsettled them. For some of you, this person measured their importance by their ability to change your emotional state. If you became upset, they knew they still mattered. If you defended yourself, they knew their opinion still carried weight. If you chased clarity, they knew they could still create distance and make you close it. But you did not give them that measurement. You felt the pressure without performing it. That is a different kind of strength. Not aggression, not punishment, not pretending that nothing affected you. You may have felt everything. Your heart may have been beating faster. You may have needed time afterward to process what happened, but they did not receive unrestricted access to that process. And without your reaction, they were left alone with their own intentions. You may have noticed them repeat a point after you did not respond the first time. Maybe they changed the subject quickly, became slightly harsher, or suddenly softened their voice. Perhaps they ended the call sooner than expected, because the conversation was no longer producing the emotional result they had prepared for. The confidence began to shift. Now, I want to be careful here. They may not consciously understand why your calm affected them. They may simply know that the call did not feel the way they expected it to feel. The power they anticipated was replaced by confusion, and the Seven of Cups says that confusion continued. After the call, they may have replayed your pauses, your tone, the words you chose not to say. They may have wondered whether your silence meant you knew more than you revealed. Because now they could not tell which possibility was true. So what happened behind the scenes when they returned without the reaction they had promised? We have the High Priestess reversed. Okay, this shows what began to crack behind the scenes. The hidden story could no longer stay hidden. The High Priestess reversed can symbolize information being mishandled, assumptions being treated as truth, or private impressions becoming distorted once too many people are involved. For some of you, the caller may have returned to someone else, expecting to confirm what they had already said about you. That you would become jealous. That you would panic. That you would reveal more than you intended. But they had no clear reaction to bring back. So the story lost its support. They could not honestly say, "See, I told you," because you did not behave the way they predicted. And when a plan depends on another person performing a specific role, calmness can expose how much of the story was constructed before the evidence ever existed. Now there may have been tension. Perhaps the person who encouraged the call began questioning whether the caller still had the influence they claimed to have. Maybe the caller minimized your composure, exaggerated a small detail, or tried to interpret your silence as proof of something it did not actually prove, because they needed an explanation. They returned empty-handed, and somebody noticed. The High Priestess reversed also speaks to what happens when people build an alliance around incomplete information. If two people had been reinforcing the same version of you, then your actual behavior created a problem between them. One person may have expected the other to produce evidence. The other may have expected you to provide it. Neither expectation was met. And you did not have to confront anyone. You did not have to expose the conversation, demand the truth, or prove that their assumptions were unfair. You simply refused to become the version of you that their plan required. That was enough. The structure began weakening because it was never built on a full understanding of you. It was built on selective memories, old reactions, and confidence that your emotional attachment could still be used as leverage. But the real shock was not only that you stayed quiet. It was the possibility that you no longer needed this connection in the same way. That changed everything. Because if you were no longer afraid of losing access to them, then they could no longer use withdrawal as proof of power. And if your value no longer depended on being king chosen by them, their judgment had nowhere to land. So now we have to ask a deeper question. Were they truly judging your worth? Or were they projecting their own fear of being replaceable? The next card is going to show us what was underneath the coldness, and why their accusation may have described them more than it ever described you. We have the Ace of Pentacles. Okay. This brings the question of value into a much clearer form. They knew you had something real to offer. The Ace of Pentacles can symbolize substance, stability, and an opportunity that carries genuine value. So the judgment they placed on you may not have come from believing you were worthless. It may have come from knowing that your presence had weight, and fearing what would happen if you recognized that fully. For some of you, it was emotionally convenient for this person to describe you as needy, dramatic, overly sensitive, or too invested. That version of you allowed them to avoid looking at their own behavior. If you were too emotional, they did not have to examine why they kept provoking emotion. If you were seeking validation, they did not have to admit how carefully they monitored your reaction. And if you were easy to control, they never had to consider the possibility that you could choose something healthier. Here's what is interesting. The Ace of Pentacles is not chasing anything. It is an offer. It has value before anyone accepts it. That may be the deeper truth they were trying not to face. Your loyalty, patience, emotional intelligence, and willingness to build something meaningful were not signs of scarcity. They were resources. And once you stopped placing those resources into an unstable connection, the loss became visible. So they may have acted indifferent while listening closely for pain in your voice. They may have questioned your worth, while secretly needing confirmation that their opinion still mattered. They may have presented themselves as detached, while carefully measuring whether you would reach for them. But that was emotional performance. Your calm was different. Your calm came from a boundary. You were not trying to produce an effect. You were deciding where your energy belonged. And the moment they could no longer make you doubt your value, they were forced to confront what their behavior might cost them. Even if no apology came, even if they never admitted it. The failed trap created accountability because the outcome could not be blamed on your reaction. You gave them no scene to use as a distraction. There was only their approach, their intention, and the silence that followed. But when someone loses access to an old emotional pressure point, they may not stop immediately. They may simply change the method. The next card is going to show us the follow-up move, and why the second attempt may sound much softer than the first. We have the 8 of Wands. Okay, this suggests the follow-up may happen quickly, not necessarily with another dramatic call. This feels more like a message designed to lower the temperature and see whether the door is still open. For some of you, it may sound casual. Just checking on you. I saw something that reminded me of you. I hope you're doing okay. Maybe they send a joke, bring up an old memory, or speak as though the previous conversation was not as charged as it actually was. The tone may be lighter, the wording may feel softer. And because the 8 of Wands represents movement and communication, there could be an attempt to move past the uncomfortable part before it has been acknowledged. They may want momentum, but momentum is not the same as repair. Now, I want to keep this balanced. Not every kind message carries a hidden intention. People can reflect. People can regret how they handled something. And sometimes a softer approach comes from a genuine desire to make things right. But sincerity does not avoid accountability. That is the difference. A real attempt at repair can name what happened. It can recognize the tone, the pressure, or the impact without making you explain why it hurt. A reset attempt usually skips over all of that. It reaches for familiarity while leaving the original behavior untouched. The message may be warm, but what is missing? That is what your discernment is noticing now. Are they asking how you feel, or are they checking whether you are still available? Are they trying to understand you? Or are they trying to restore the access they had before the call? Do they respect the slower pace you choose, or do they become impatient when you do not immediately return to the old level of closeness? Their response to your boundary will reveal more than the message itself. Because someone can sound gentle while still expecting the same outcome. And this time, you do not have to assume the worst. You also do not have to ignore the pattern. You can allow the words to arrive without letting them decide what happens next. You can pause, you can observe, you can see whether consistency follows the communication. The 8 of Wands says the energy is moving, but you choose the direction. That is the change. You are no longer reacting from fear that the connection will disappear. You are deciding whether the connection, as it currently exists, belongs in your life. The next card is going to show the moment the power dynamic fully changes. Not because you win the argument, but because you stop participating in the old emotional contract. We have the moon reversed. Okay, this is the moment the confusion begins to lose its power. The moon reversed can symbolize what happens when fear is no longer allowed to interpret everything for you. The uncertainty may still be present, but it is not controlling the decision anymore. That is the shift. For some of you, the old emotional contract required you to stay confused. As long as you were wondering what they meant, whether they cared, or what you could do differently, your attention remained fixed on them. Confusion kept the door open. But now you are seeing the pattern more clearly. You are not ignoring this person to punish them. You are not withholding affection to create the same anxiety they tried to create in you. You are simply no longer offering emotional intimacy where honesty, safety, and accountability are missing. Those are different things. The Ace of Cups appeared reversed at the beginning because your emotional energy was no longer flowing automatically toward this connection. And now, the Moon reversed shows that you understand why. You did not lose your ability to love. You stopped confusing love with unlimited access. You may still care about this person. You may remember moments when the connection felt sincere. There may still be grief around what you hoped it could become. But caring does not erase what you observed. Missing someone does not make the pattern healthy. And remembering the good does not require you to return to the role that exhausted you. They expected emotional scarcity. They believed that if they made the connection feel uncertain, you would accept almost anything to keep it. They thought being chosen by them would matter more than how you were treated by them. But you recognized something. Access to you has value. Your attention has value. Your emotional honesty has value. And those things are not owed to someone simply because they know how to activate your feelings. That is where the trap fully failed. Not when you stayed silent. Not when the call ended. It failed when you stopped confusing being chosen with being valued. Because now, even if they return with softer words, you are not listening only to the promise. You are watching the pattern. You are noticing whether their behavior creates clarity or asks you to live inside uncertainty again. The Moon is reversed. The fog is lifting. And the final card is going to show what this experience was meant to teach you, so you can close this chapter without carrying their judgment into whatever comes next. We have the King of Swords reversed. Okay, this brings the entire message back to the judgment that started the call. Someone believed they had the authority to define you. The King of Swords reversed can symbolize conclusions formed without fairness, words used as leverage, or a person presenting their opinion as though it were the final truth. They may have entered that conversation convinced they understood your motives, your emotional limits, and the amount of disrespect you would tolerate. But their judgment was based on an outdated image. They remembered the version of you who explained everything. The version who tried to correct every misunderstanding. The version who believed that if you found the right words, you could make someone treat your heart more carefully. That was the person they called. But that was not the person who answered. And this is the lesson. Your victory was not proving them wrong through a perfect argument. It was not humiliating them, exposing them, or forcing an apology they may not yet be capable of giving. Your victory was remaining aligned with yourself while someone tried to pull you into a version of the conversation that had already been written for you. You interrupted the script. The Ace of Cups was reversed because your emotions were no longer available on command. Not because your heart had closed, but because your heart had developed standards. And the King of Swords reversed shows that you no longer accept another person's distorted judgment as evidence about your worth. Their certainty does not make them correct. Their discomfort does not make your boundary cruel. Their inability to access you in the old way does not mean you have become cold. Silence will not be the answer in every situation. There are moments when truth needs to be spoken clearly. But in this moment, the pause gave you something the pressure was designed to remove. Choice. You had time to recognize the pattern. You had space to separate their words from your identity. And you protected yourself without becoming the reaction they expected to use against you. Take what reflects your experience here and leave the rest. But if this message is yours, remember that people sometimes test a boundary when they sense that access is changing. Their frustration does not mean the boundary is wrong. It may simply mean the boundary is working. You did not fail to respond. You refused to become the reaction someone else had already written for you. And that is where I'm going to leave this reading. Protect your clarity, trust what your body recognized, and let your peace speak for itself. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you in the next one.